I'm going to give you another conceptual framework, because I know you love them as much as I do. But if you look at the integrated model, and again, this is in the article that's in your packet, the evidence-based principles that we're talking about, okay, see, did I call it a 10-minute break? People still can't get back to their seats by quarter time.
You know me.
Hydration is important. Everybody get your water. But you can listen while you're making your way back to your seat. So the whole evidence-based principles are all in that top light blue circle. And what it really suggests is that, and you guys have already pointed it out numerous times in the first hour, is that they don't stand alone. That an individual organization cannot take on board the principles and say, now I am evidence-based. I'm an evidence-based principle organization. There have to be two other major components for this really to work. One of them, which has already come up a couple times, is collaboration. And again, the whole purpose of bringing together a collaborative group to have this conversation is, I think, just reaffirming that the evidence-based principles don't stand alone. Probation cannot be an evidence-based agency in a vacuum. Right? The county has to be on board, the district attorney, the public defender, the sheriff, the CBOs, the housing, the mental health. Everybody has to be on board, at least with a common language. Again, that was definitely someone's goal for this morning, a common understanding of what we're talking about. Not even necessarily that your whole organization will utilize these principles, but the part of your organization that intersects with those people who are criminally involved, justice involved. I think where those intersections take place, if we're all on the same page, it will really help move that agenda forward. And then you can take the parts of that work in your other components of your organization, if you choose to, and put them into place as well. But definitely in that intersection where all of our different agencies are interacting with people involved in the justice system, this gives us a common framework. And then organizational development. And that's really within an organization to take this on board. And so we can have ideas, we can have concepts, we can have principles, but if you don't have infrastructure, it's not going to fly. And I think one of the informal conversations we just had on the break was case management systems, data collection tools. So we can talk, and when we get to principles 7 and 8 and we start talking about measuring impact, that's all well and good. But if there's no infrastructure for data collection, spreadsheets are beautiful. Excel is a beautiful thing, but it's also very difficult to manage a large-scale data collection effort using spreadsheets. Have we done it? Yes, we have. We've all done it. And we will continue to do it. But when you can have an integrated case management system where your frontline workers, whether they be therapists, clinicians, officers, case managers, are sitting down and entering data because it helps them do their job better, and that data on the back end actually helps us understand the impact of their job, that's the ideal, right? How do we start to get there? That's an example of organizational development. Can you run an organization where one person out of the organization understands evidence-based practices but nobody else does? No. That's organizational development. Does leadership have the information they need? Do they have the will and the desire to move the organization in that way? So that may be organizational assessments. And if we have time at the end, we'll talk a little bit more about some of those infrastructure requirements for evidence-based practices. So just remember, as we go through the principles, pretty much our whole morning is in that top loop, but that's not all of it. So I just want to kind of put it into that larger context before we start breaking it down. Okay, so if you want to keep track where we are, you have a little picture of the evidence-based practices in the middle slide on the second page, but we're kind of going to now start breaking it down. So we're starting at the bottom, and I want to talk, probably this will be the longest conversation we'll have about assessing actuarial risks and needs. And again, in light of your unique county environment, I think it's helpful for this to be interactive. But I want to suggest to you something. Again, risk. We're talking about the risk to reoffend, because there's lots of kinds of risk. And what we're talking about is not going to incorporate or encompass all of them. What we want to know in terms of evidence-based principles is, how likely is this person to reoffend? How much do you think you need to know about a person to gauge their risk of recidivism, of continued criminal activity? How many things do you need to know?
Everything, as much as possible.
You want to know as much as possible. You want to know everything. Okay, how likely is that? Right? Because now we're talking about a psychosocial history. We're talking about skilled clinicians who are going to engage with someone, and the more you know someone, the better you're going to, right, have this information. They're not going to spill everything about their history to someone, in a uniform, a badge, and a gun on the first conversation. They don't feel maybe safe. They don't feel trusting. So if we want everything and we think we need everything to assess risk, we may fall short pretty quickly. So now think about for a second that word actuarial. And think, right, where in your life, pretty much every day, do you get actuarially risk assessed? Life insurance? And car insurance. Okay, especially when your kids turn 16, all of a sudden, actuarial risk assessment hits you in the head. I have twins. They just turned 17 yesterday, so they're not 16 anymore, but you still get that actuarial risk thing. Okay, so what do they want to know? When you go buy auto insurance, do they want to, wouldn't it be nice if they knew everything about you before they set your rates? Right? But they don't, because you want to tell them what a great driver you are and how careful your 16-year-old son is. And that he's never going to get in an accident. And he's really good and he never listens to the radio or lets his friends yell from the back seat. Okay, but they don't care. They don't care about your kid. What do they want to know? How old is he? Is he a boy? Oh, that's all they want to know. How old is he and is he a boy? And there you go. You just got to pay like a lot of money for his car insurance. Why? But my boy's a good boy. He doesn't do anything bad. They don't care. Okay? So now you've got and they might want to know your zip code. Right? Because they're going to make a whole bunch of assumptions about you and your behavior based on your zip code. Is that fair? It's so not fair. They might ask you if you park your car in the garage, but some of them don't even care about that anymore. They used to ask you that more. I don't even think they care anymore if you park in the garage because, I don't know, you leave your garage door open, they come and steal your car. Okay, so they want to know 3 things about you, and then they're going to tell you how much your car insurance costs. That's actuarial risk assessment at its finest. And you may walk away feeling like it's unfair, but does it all work out pretty well for the insurance companies? Why does it work out so well? Because hundreds of thousands of people later, those patterns actually bear out. Young men who live in particular zip codes file a lot more claims against their insurance than older females who live in a different zip code. Unfair? Maybe, but it works out that way. Now we're talking about criminal justice risk. What do we want to know about that offender to determine how likely he or she is to reoffend? Actuarial risk assessment. Now I don't have the luxury of a clinical assessment, a psychosocial history. I don't have time, I don't have money, I don't have energy, and I need this to work out mathematically. So what do I need to know? Age. I still want to know age, right? Because younger people are more likely to offend. We know that the number one cure for criminal behavior is growing up. The older you get, the less likely you are to offend. It's true, it's true, it's true. So young, you're a much higher risk. The younger you are, the higher your risk. Okay.
How long were they incarcerated?
Okay, how long they were incarcerated? I'm going to use that, and I'm going to broaden it out a little bit, and I'm going to say we want to know something about their criminal justice history, which is going to be highly correlated with how long they did, right? Because you got to work your way up, especially these days. You got to work your way into a long sentence. So if you've got someone coming out of prison on a 15-year bid, right, they did something probably pretty bad. So what we want to know is, let's just call it criminal justice history, because we don't need to parse all the deets, but we do definitely need to know something about how many times they've been blank. Arrested, charged, convicted, reincarcerated. I'm going to make the same argument I made for recidivism. I don't want to get bogged down in, because really in the end, It's all about the same. But I need to know something about how, because our best prediction of future behavior is past performance, okay? Just like in the stock market. Okay, so I want to know something about your past. I want to know something about how old you are. And if I only let you have 3 things, what would be the third one? Gender. Boys are worse than girls. Same as in car insurance. Sorry, it's just the way it works out. Is it fair? No, but it's true. Numbers. I'm just talking about numbers. I'm not talking people. I'm not talking heart. I'm not talking soul. I'm talking numbers. All right, so now if I told you all you needed to know was 3 things, age, gender, and criminal history, and I could tell you how likely this person was to reoffend, would you believe me? No? Tell me why.
What about education?
You'd want to know something about their education?
Yeah, I would want to know something about the education because it's been proven the longer education, the better decision you make.
Absolutely, and I'm not going to disagree with you at all. We want to know something about their education, but I'm talking about, I'm going to use one of my favorite research words. I want the most parsimonious model. I want the fewest number of pieces of information I can possibly get and still get an answer on this. I'm going to tell you that those 3 are it. Is there more helpful information that I could gather? Absolutely. Interestingly enough, when you start to get beyond those 3, you actually start adding error. So I'm talking about, and stop at the slash. Assess actuarial risk. I'm not talking about needs yet. Just talking about risk. And the reason I want to keep it parsimonious is because it's cheaper, right? We've got resource issues. We've got a lot of people maybe coming, everybody that's being booked. Do I have time to gather all this information about them? No, but those 3 pieces of information, pretty much, my booking officer has already. And he's already putting it in, he or she is already putting it in a case management system or your local variation of your booking system. It's already in there. So if I created an algorithm to pull out those 3 pieces of information and tell you, like this, is this person high, medium, or low risk? You could probably do it tomorrow if you're not already doing it. You may already be doing it. So every individual in your system, when I say system, I mean criminal justice system, we already know how likely they are to reoffend. Okay, are we utilizing that information? You have to tell me. But we know it because there is actually an assessment tool written by Brad Bogue, who you will notice is one of your authors on that article, called the Proxy. And he's got the algorithm behind it. In other words, you get 1 point for being male, 1 point for being under whatever his age cutoff, and then however many points for each of the criminal justice history. So it's I'm making it simple. There's a little bit more to it, but actually not that much more. And we could know the risk assessment, the likelihood that someone would reoffend pretty dang quickly for every individual who comes into your system at whatever you think is the first point of entry. And the sooner we know it, the sooner we can start making decisions based on it.
So I'm a little bothered by that.
I bet.
The income is not factored in at all, so poverty specifically, and ethnicity. So if we look at the criminal justice system and its biases toward people of color and the overrepresentation of certain groups, those 3 factors may in fact predict, but then do they become your framework for developing strategies to reverse behavior or change behavior so that you don't remain in systems? I'm just bothered.
Yes, and thank you. And I really appreciate you verbalizing that, and I think you verbalized it so I don't know if everybody could hear, but it's really kind of bothersome. It's really bothersome when you reduce human beings with all kinds of complex characteristics into those 3 things. I'd be bothered too. Right? And then you add on the issues of how did you get that criminal history? Well, maybe it was already compounded, like you said, by disproportionate criminal justice intervention on peoples of color. And now we're just taking it and compounding it. How is that fair? It's not, right? And remember, I started off by saying the same way that when they sell your kid car insurance, they don't care what a good kid he is. They care that he's a 16-year-old boy. It's not fair. Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And then it gets compounded by the mistakes that we've already made. We're making them again on top of that. So that, okay. And I'm going to also just leave it for a second that it does accurately predict the likelihood that someone's going to reoffend, fair or not fair. Then we really have to ask ourselves, where does the person come in? Because we care about people. We don't care about numbers. We don't care about proxies. We don't care about statistics. We care about people. That's what we're trying to change. We're trying to change people. So what do we need to do now to move from this kind of cold, hard, soulless, soul-sucking actuarial risk assessment into what we really care about? That's, in my mind, where we move into this needs assessment. But I wanted to talk about them separately for a second because we tend to say we need to assess risks and needs, and then we move right on to education. Or we move right on to substance abuse history, or we want to know about your family background, or when was the last time you were employed, or more clinical information about your mental health. Yes, we care about all that stuff. But in the end, that is really understanding the person's needs. And while we need to do both, I don't want us to make the mistake of blurring them together. Even though the principle says assess risks and needs, and I think a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, we got a risk-need assessment. So the JACE and the CASE, and though someone can help me with what they stand for.
Correctional Assessment and Intervention System.
Thank you, Correctional Assessment and Intervention System. And this is a national NCCD, National Crime.
National Council on Crime and Delinquency.
Thank you. National Council on Crime and Delinquency. So the CASE is a NCCD risk and need assessment, and it helps us understand people. So I just want to make the point again. I want to pull them apart before we stick them back together, so that we understand clearly that risk assessment really is actuarial. Really doesn't have to do a lot with the humans that we care about. It really has to do with an actuarial prediction of likelihood to reoffend. And we'll see in a few minutes why that's important. So now we care about the needs. And we care about needs because we need to intervene based on this individual's characteristics, who they are as a person, what makes them tick, what things have happened in the past, what, maybe for lack of a better word, what deficiencies they're bringing to the table. So that we can address them, because again, that's why we're here. And I want to make a distinction then. So how do you gather information about needs? I'm sorry? Through the assessment. So we might, but we need the person there. So what's interesting about the proxy is we can get a risk score without ever looking at a person. We can pull your booking data for the last 10 years, I could run an algorithm on it, and I can tell you how the risk of the individuals that you've booked over the last 10 years has changed. And I've never sat face-to-face with an individual. I don't know anything about their racial makeup. I don't know anything about the school system in your area, but I can do it, and it'll be accurate. But the needs is different. The needs, I need a person. The needs, I need to interact with someone. I need to do a face-to-face. I need to know what they think. I need to know what their perception of their reality is. Because again, I maybe can get records on their objective school education history, but what I want to know from them is, how have you experienced school, right? Mm-hmm. Have you been successful at school? That may be grades, but it might be something inside this person where they say, yeah, well, I kind of got B's and C's, but I never felt like I belonged, or I never felt, because my mom was homeless and I never felt like this was a good place for me. There's so much more to it than just grades, or there can be. So now all of a sudden we have people. And what's interesting is the needs assessments, from a criminal justice standpoint, are going to focus on what we call criminogenic needs. And those are those needs. I want to show you. I just want to show you this because I probably shouldn't have jumped ahead like that, but I want to show you what they are, because this is a language, bringing people together on language issue. These may not be what you think of as needs if you're a substance abuse counselor, or a homeless person, someone that intervenes with people that are homeless. Because they're not even on there. Where'd they go? Okay, so now there's two things going on. Now we have what we call criminogenic needs, and these are the things that the appropriate works is based on. These are the things that were shown through research that if you address these things, you can expect to see recidivism decrease. So what about the other ones? And by the way, these are in order of what we call beta weights. All right, so when these are looked at in relation to how much weight they can bring to bear on the reduction of recidivism, these are in order. Look where substance abuse is. It's at the bottom. This is a little bit of turning what we understand needs to be on its head. And I think it's important to kind of sit with this, again, because we're coming from so many different perspectives, to sit with this not because what your perspective is wrong, but because it may be different than a criminal justice needs assessment perspective. So what we know is and so what are you going to do if you want to intervene with a criminal justice involved individual in your treatment? What are you going to intervene on? What they think and who they hang around with. That's not always how we think about treatment or intervention, right? So you may be doing a whole lot of other assessments to understand this person from now education's up there, work and education, and again, partly work and education is together because, and again, we haven't dealt a whole lot with juveniles, but if you've got a juvenile, you're not going to have work problems, you're going to have educational problems. But even for an adult, knowing what happened while they were in education is important.
Excuse me, I see a lot of isolation.
A lot of social isolation. And again, that's few pro-social associates where people are isolated. So they may not be around a whole lot of negative people, but they're certainly not around positive people either, or engaged in positive activities in the community. And even that leisure, few pro-social activities. When you're isolated, you're not engaged in pro-social activities. So I'm just going to finish my point, and then I'm going to ask both of you guys to make a comment. What I want to point out is that these are the criminogenic need factors, and they don't speak to a lot of the need factors that would be important to a provider. Does that mean that the provider's perspective of needs is not important? No. No, it does not. What it means is where we intersect with the criminal justice involved individual, it would be important to be mindful of these needs in addition to the needs that you're already expert at. And some of them, these may already be folded in, but it may be helpful to be mindful of them in the way that they're written here if the goal is to reduce continued criminal behavior. And that might be an additional goal to the other goals that you have prioritized for your agency.
Thank you for answering that. And, what we found through our research is that all the criminogenic needs usually happen because of the substance abuse. The population that we serve in the prisons and the jails usually started abusing substances around 9, 10 years old. So all these other things came into play as a direct result of the substance abuse.
Yeah.
A lot of times, kids are getting loaded, they're not going to school, or, they're high, and of course they're gonna have antisocial attitudes because their minds haven't finished developing. So 9 times out of 10, all of these things are brought on due to substance abuse beginning at an early age, or some kind of physical or sexual abuse happening early on, even younger than 10 years old.
Okay, so I think, so you're speaking a little bit to etiology, right? What came first, the chicken or the egg, right? And you're saying the substance abuse is kind of our egg, and it's leading to our chicken of criminal behavior, which suggests that if you intervene, sorry to have my back to you guys, if you intervene with substance abuse, you will intervene with crime. I'm going to suggest, it may look a little different than this, and I'm going to suggest something that is called a recursive model, right? Which has to do with there being perhaps some other variable, which we might think of as criminal thinking, so distorted thinking, that leads to two things. It leads to substance abuse, and it leads to crime. And then substance abuse creates crime, and crime then creates substance abuse. And what you really have, though, if you want to intervene, can you guys see this? In this model is actually something else that we need to actually intervene on to take care of both of these things. So I think, and that may have been what you were suggesting, but I would like us to think about this recursive model as kind of our foundation, and why, if we just intervene in substance abuse, we may have a sober criminal, right? But if we can manage that underlying thinking, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just like a sober criminal. You have a sober criminal. They're not addicting, not doing any abuse, but that thinking is still there. Then they still go out and commit crime. And I was just going to say, let's say as a teacher, and you're dealing with kids and having to deal with a lot of problem kids, and they're thinking that, and especially kids with disabilities, it's they're in a situation or that is just where their mind is. And let's say for a lot of kids with disabilities, they're high anxiety, there's usually a lot of stress at home, conflict, and substance abuse is a way of dealing with that anxiety, but then there's the fallout of that, which includes criminal activity.
And in and of itself is a criminal activity, right? So
for me as an educator, and what I've seen over 20 years of teaching and just research, I'm just that kind of person, is the antisocial part. These little kids, they come in preschool. I deal from the whole gamut. Preschool, kinder, all the way to high school, just their minds and their attitudes, and they're in the environment where they are, that it's not dealt with effectively, if for one reason or another, that then drives everything else. And that's my perspective as an educator.
thank you. And I'm sorry to, I detoured.
I was trying to process the list,
Okay,
which you said is in order of, I guess, frequency.
well, it's in order of its impact on recidivism.
Okay. And do you take the list as a whole and keep that in mind as you're doing your interventions, other interventions, or those specific to that? Or can you pick among the list and say, this is the more relevant, or these are the more relevant to my population, so we'll focus on that?
Yeah, and I think it may be, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you. I think the answer to that is maybe coming from the goals of the organization that you're within. So where you may have as if you're a substance abuse agency, you may very well focus on substance abuse. That makes sense. If you're a domestic violence or helping parenting, you may focus more on the family marital. But hopefully, because this risk need assessment is going to be done ideally as close to the beginning of the criminal justice process as possible, you're going to get appropriate referrals of those individuals who are justice involved, who that is one of their top needs. So I think, again, that really goes back to that collaborative issue, is that hopefully you wouldn't get a individual that has equal high needs in all of these areas, and you're thinking, well, that's not my organization's mission. So I think some of this is fit, but if we don't know what the prioritized needs are, we may not make an appropriate referral. So I think part of the needs assessment at the beginning, at the front end, is that the probation officer or case manager has the ability to look at the array of services in the community where this person lives, and then say, these are the prioritized referrals that I would make. And it may be, you're gonna go over here and do this first, and then when that need is taken care of, we move on to something else. And that has to do with the priority of the need of the individual. And again, so none of this works if we just set a plan and then shoot people through it. We really need to understand it. And then that's why the needs assessment really is the human part of this, is really the individual needs of the person. But I will say that the criminal thinking, do you get people in the criminal justice system who don't have criminal thinking? You do. You have situational offenders, people who get themselves in a mess for a variety of reasons, or you've seen them. They may, but for the most part, do most people have criminal thinking issues who are in the system? Yeah, most do. You may get a homeless person who got caught up, and then FTAs and blah blah blah, and all soon they're kind of up here in the criminal justice system, and they don't have a similar profile as other offenders. So that's why also thinking about people in terms of constellations of needs as opposed to individual, right? So people are all a mixture of these needs. It's which ones are rising to the top and which one is sort of dominant. And some of this risk assessment tools actually provide typologies, or how do people fit together in a more 3D way than just linear like this. Was there any other comments?
Well, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Well, this might be skipping ahead, but I'm thinking in terms of research and data collection and analysis, even for an organization with very limited funding, that with this, here's this, I'm gonna say this vetted model. It's successful for what it does. But as you're working with your client population and thinking about funders, because that's where this is going towards, and what they want to see an objective, here's you on the ground, here's the population working with, what you think works. But, the funders probably want to see, like, what's a more objective, proven model. And just sort of, one thing to think about would be, yes, you're doing these wonderful things on the ground, but keeping that in mind, how it relates to this model when talking to funders. So,
Thank you. Yeah.
To me, that just what came into my mind, and just how the funder perspective.
Thank you.
My thing is the recipe. The recipe itself is just something that I see every day in this program. That recipe from foster care, from in-home, hanging out, gang-related, that's the recipe for substance abuse.
Yep.
Which takes it all the way in. So to me, it's pretty much like a setup. Because in the, I'm gonna talk about my community, in East Palo Alto, and being there for most of my life, the uniqueness of East Palo Alto from any other city, Oakland, and San Jose, was that the unity, all of those attributes broke down that unity. And that's what became all of us at mental health and don't know, death, a lot of death, highest murder rate, and the substance abuse. But to backpedal all of that is to install those things that were taken away. You understand what I'm saying? Every day in my home, we're a community that's one. They look out for one another. They take care of one another. They feed one another. They help one another. That's mandatory in the community and home. They make community decisions, and they rely on one another. And that's what has helped them not go back into it.
And so I think, just to be, I think what I'm hearing is this looks cut and dried, and it's still leaving out for you the soul of it, and the part where people come together to support one another and to create an environment where people can succeed. And I think that's the danger of any sort of academic model, is you're feeling that lack. And I think what we can do is acknowledge it and remember that we need to bring that part back in, and that's really the part between the people that care about one another and the faith-based, commitment that are in neighborhoods where the churches are taking a role with the schools and with the other community institutions, and we can't leave that out. So I appreciate you bringing that back into the conversation, and I think that the model itself, again, because it's coming out of academia, it is missing. It's missing. So I think we just need to be mindful that there's another component of this that really is the heart and soul of the helping community. So this second, any other comments on the first one before I kind of move on? So that got you riled up, that's good, and gave you something to think about. And again, these are not meant to be this is kind of a 12-step program, right? Take what you like and leave the rest. This is, I am not trying to jam this down your throat, and I'm not telling you how to behave or what to think. I'm offering you a different way of looking at this, and I ask that you take it in, think it through, see what resonates, see what makes sense, see what you may want to bring back to your agency. And I'm not necessarily saying that this is about opinions, but again, people change incrementally by gathering additional information, and that's what I would like for us to see ourselves as this morning. So enhancing intrinsic motivation, again, nothing new. We do this in our lives, we do this with our kids, we do this in our community. It's always better when you can get someone to think something was their idea than to try to tell them what to do. And I did mention I have two 17-year-olds, right? I know. You can. I have a 19-year-old too, but she's practically human. But my littler daughter, her thing is, I'll say, right, good morning, and she says, don't tell me how to live my life. That's her new little phrase. Don't tell me how to live my life. Okay. But so we have to spend a lot of time creatively trying to figure out how to get people to come up with things that we want them to do, but they think it's their own idea. Okay, that's all this really is. But it's actually very important, and I'm making a little bit light of it, but I don't see this lightly. I see this as self-determination. We all are entitled to create a life for ourselves that works for ourselves. And to the extent that probation and parole have been for years in the business of imposing the way to live your life, it may be one of the reasons why we haven't been totally successful. And maybe it's time to step back and ask a question instead of tell the answer. And what is the question? Because I can guarantee you that very many people who come across on a PO's caseload, a probation officer's caseload, or a parole agent's caseload, do want to change. It's not enough to just tell them to change. If it was that easy, they would have already done it, right? And it's not even enough to tell people why they should change. Because again, most of us know why. We want to get our kids back. We want to live in a community that is peaceful. We want a lot of things. And it's not, there's no us and them, right? We all want the same goal. The question is, how do you get people to take that on board internally? And I thank God every day that I have this inside me. I want to do the things that are good for me and for my family and for my community. I mean, I can't even tell you how grateful I am for that feeling that I have. How did I get it? Honestly, I don't know, but it's in me. And so the question is it something that's in you or not in you? And if you're born without it or somehow you're not motivated to change, can that ever change? And all I will suggest to you is just think of all of ourselves in terms of exercise and diet, right? Okay, for me, this is pretty universal. We all want to eat better and exercise more. Well, why don't we do it? We know it's good for us. We know and really, when is your motivation? So am I motivated to eat well and exercise? It depends on when you ask me. It's not a yes or no question. It's not black or white, it depends. Monday morning, pretty much I'm motivated. Friday afternoon, not so much, right? So hiking or happy hour? Yeah, I don't know. It just depends how my week went. So I guess I'm just suggesting that motivation is always changing. Mm-hmm. It's an internal state that does not remain consistent. And guess what? It's exactly the same for offenders. Their motivation changes day by day, hour by hour, and sometimes minute by minute. So when I hear a PO say to me, well, I'm willing to help those that want help. Really? Okay, that's great, but just assume that they all want help then. Because if you're going to tell me that you're going to be able to figure out who it is that's motivated to change by talking to them, I'm going to tell you I disagree wholeheartedly. So if you want to only help the people that want help, now I'm talking to POs, then you need to help everyone, because you don't know. And the one that you don't think is motivated to want help today may want it tomorrow. But it is helpful as a provider, and when I say that, I'm going to use it, writ large, POs, agents, case managers, clinicians, everybody, any of us who are providing something. It's helpful to understand where the person in front of me is right now. Not because I want to pigeonhole them, not because I think they're going to stay there forever, but because it may change the way I interact with you if I understand a little bit about where you're coming from. And I'm not so baffled by your behavior either. So how is it that you're sitting in front of me and you have 2 DUIs and 3 drug possessions and you're telling me you don't have a problem? Well, are you out of your mind? No, you're pre-contemplative. This is very helpful to know from a criminal justice intervention perspective. And again, I'm talking to the experts here, so but it's helpful to know that I can now give it a label and I can understand that people are pre-contemplative a lot. A lot of us don't have any problems until all of a sudden you go and they put that flipping thing on your arm and it puffs up, and then my doctor says, you have high blood pressure. I can't. That's not possible. I don't have a problem. Well, I'm going to make write your prescription. I don't need a prescription because I don't have high blood pressure. Well, that little thing just said you did was wrong. I had my legs crossed. That's always my excuse, right? You know, they tell you put your feet on the floor. Like, oh yeah, wait, I was stressed out because I had a doctor's appointment. Do it again. Right, we're all pre-contemplative about something. So when your offender says something to you about they don't have a problem, that's where they are. It's helpful to know. It's helpful to note it, because when you take that pre-contemplative person and send them to treatment and tell them they need help and tell them this is how they're going to get help and how long they're going to stay there for, then we're shocked when they go AWOL. Shocked. We should not be shocked when we send pre-contemplative people to treatment. They will not stay. They are not ready, right? Can a PO or a case manager do anything about it? Or do I have to just throw up my hands and say, pre-contemplative, next. Give me someone who's motivated to change. Give me somebody I can help. There are methodologies, and these are when Rich talked this morning about motivational interviewing, again, this is probably something that the criminal justice system is borrowing now from treatment, integrating more frequently into the way we do business. But I think it happens on both sides of the table. So in other words, now you get a referral from probation to take someone in, and you're thinking, I don't think this person's going to stay, but you feel like, well, if I don't take probation referrals, they may not send me anybody else. There may be other, compounding issues locally and environmentally about why you might take someone. So what can you do on the agency side then to move someone from pre-contemplative to contemplative? And again, where we really want people is we want to get people to that determination stage, preparation, then you make the referral. Oh, look, now they went. Now they move themselves into action, and they stay there and they get the treatment. So this principle, this enhanced intrinsic motivation, is really probably aimed more at the criminal justice side of the house, to get officers to really understand that people don't come to you ready for treatment, that sometimes it's your job to help them get ready, and it's not by threatening to arrest them. Nobody goes from pre-contemplation to contemplation to preparation because they got threatened. In fact, if anything, it moves you back. Okay, so this one, and again, this is kind of the blood pressure example, just kind of a visual, what it looks like, but it sounds like this is kind of where I'm getting head nods because I can go faster on this, right?
Can you go back to the 0 to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to 9 minutes a little bit?
Okay, because this is this is your real time. Thank you. Okay, and this is again, this is not my work. This is the standard stages of change. This is in the stages of change literature. But there's definitely a belief that if someone can act in a certain manner for that, the 3 to 6 months, that's the action portion of it, that changes will stick. And in criminal justice, there's something that we call dosage. And interestingly enough, dosage has to do with risk level. The higher the risk you are to reoffend, the more intervention you need. Which that seems intuitive, right? So think about, now let me give you the numbers and this is the part of the evidence-based practices that has less evidence than some of the other parts. So the risk part, the risk need principle that we're going to talk about in 1 second is pretty well, it's been in existence for like 30 years. The positive reinforcement goes way back, that's like old school behaviorism, right? But this part, the dosage is a little newer and the science is still coming in on this. But what they say is low risk requires 100 hours of dosage, medium, 200 hours, high risk, 300 hours of dosage. Think about that for a second. And I think, so we're hitting your real time? Oh, I feel so good about that. That's a lot of time. Now let me tell you what dosage really means. and I'm going to channel Ed Latessa. Do you guys know who Ed Latessa is? Okay, so he's like the guru in this area. I'm going to channel him for a second, and I'm going to tell you what Ed would say dosage is. Dosage is not just being in the treatment center. It's not being in the waiting room, waiting for your group to start. It's not, I don't know, we give our guys cup of noodles when they come in. It's not eating your cup of noodles. It is cognitive behavioral intervention only. So even if you're doing job readiness, and I'm not devaluing job readiness at all, or making referrals, or providing health information, or how to get signed up for Medicaid, all really good things that we want to be doing for all of the people we deal with, none of that actually counts. The only thing that counts for dosage is it can be individual or group, cognitive behaviorally based intervention. Now let's talk about a high-risk offender needing 300 hours of that. And now do the math, and you can tell me what the real-time impact of that is. What are we doing when we send someone to an 8-hour class? Do you guys have this in San Mateo, theft reduction? And you send them to a class for 8 hours? No, we do this in San Diego. We used to, you used to? You don't, okay. So there are some sort of magical beliefs that if you send someone to go do something for some very short period of time, that somehow we're going to change their behavior. With the prostitution impact panel, do you guys have that? Okay. We send Johns to go sit in front of prostitutes who tell them for 8 hours or 4 hours, and somehow this is going to change their behavior. What we know about behavior change is it takes consistent intervention, hours and hours and hours of cognitive, behaviorally based intervention to start to see change. So when we're talking about funding, when we're talking about program development, I think it's really helpful to keep that in mind. Oh, I can cross that one off my list. I feel very good about that. Okay, so we're not gonna do a motivational interviewing class. Again, this class can expand anything from the morning to 8 hours to 16 hours. But just suffice it to say that for those people who've probably already been through this training or know about it, it's basically ask more than you talk. Ask more than you tell, listen more than you talk, and allow people self-determination. So now we're on the third one, right? We're on the third principle, and after this, we're going to have the small groups, not a break. We're going to meet into small groups because I think, unless you guys tell me you want one more after this, I think there's a lot here for you guys to kind of talk about in that individual context, but I'm open to feedback on this one. So because this target interventions is kind of what we've just been talking about, kind of all condensed into one. So what it really says is provide services to the highest risk, again, risk to recidivate, based on your actuarial. So not the people that you think are the highest need, not the people who had the worst upbringing, but the people who are the most likely to reoffend should be your target group. And you should keep them separate from people who are from low-risk people. Again, depending on resources, ideally you might keep high, medium, and low risk separate, but definitely you don't want to mix high risk and low risk people together in a treatment group. Even in your lobby if you can help it. Because what do high-risk people do? They are coaches and mentors.
Exactly.
They are your coaches and mentors for additional criminal behavior. This is why we don't want low-risk people in jail. This is why we don't want low-risk people in prison. This is why we don't want low-risk people around people who have made a more serious commitment to the criminal lifestyle, right? So the risk principle is we reserve most of our resources for the highest risk people that we're serving. And the second is that we keep people separated by risk. I think this has a lot of impact for treatment, especially when your general population is not a criminal justice involved population. And all of a sudden you start mixing in, or you have a particular program or track that's for justice involved individuals, but we haven't thought through what is that doing when you have different people in the waiting room. When are you holding your groups? There's nothing offenders like better than a Friday afternoon group that gets let out early. Right? So who else do you want in that group? You don't want your low-risk offenders hanging out with your high-risk offenders on Friday afternoon. Yes, thank you.
But I kind of disagree with
Okay,
you as well.
perfect.
I mean, because we're in a small community, it's not that big, so if they're not meeting in our program, I'm there for sure talking in the street because I see them talking in the street.
Okay.
You know, I mean, so
For you, it's not such a big deal? Okay, I appreciate you, that's why I say, right, if you're not gonna engage with me when you disagree, so they're gonna, okay. And again, then maybe we wanna think, and again, that's your local environment, and I'm gonna leave it, to you guys as the experts. Again, that's a general principle that we don't wanna create an environment where we're bringing lower risk or at-risk individuals into an environment with higher risk individuals. If you're telling me that's not an issue in your neighborhood, I respect that.
We're in the same community. Yeah. But I will say this, if that hasn't been happening and all of a sudden you see them, associating with the lower risk with the higher risk, then that's an area of concern.
Okay,
Because something is happening. Would you agree to that?
yeah, and
And then it's one thing for them to be in the community and voluntarily interact. It's a whole nother thing to create an opportunity
good point.
for them to come together like that.
So again, I think this is one of those perfect examples where you need to bring the environment and the culture and the community into what I'm saying and make it work for you. But again, as a principal, we don't want to encourage it. You may find that, it's an issue or less of an issue depending on where you are, how big your neighborhood is, yeah.
So, I don't understand why you would want to encourage it, because for, our high-risk offenders that are on high-risk parole, and, we meet every Friday night. And it's like we have this mutual learning environment where people are supporting each other and changing what they do with their Friday nights. And it's just been amazing to watch these older veterans, if you want to call them veterans of, being criminals, take the next generation under their wings and showing them a different way to respond to life's challenges.
Perfect.
And life's just day-to-day living.
Beautiful,
And I
thank
think
you.
It's working out very well that when people change, how they're living their lives, that they're able to mentor the younger next generation that's coming up behind them on how to do things differently on Friday night. So it's working real well for us having them all together.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and I think we hit on sorry, was there any other? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Just to beat the horse.
Yes, please. He's not dead yet.
We also have found that a very few, a small number of high risk in a very large group, totally reinforced and structured, can sometimes lead to a peer group shift.
Interesting.
So you have, for example, same community here, among young people, this small group of influencers who can dominate the general environment, but put in the context of a program where the idea is to change the behaviors, and you find the majority of young people are either fence straddlers or they're not there at all, but they are acting like they condone it because that's what they've learned to do to survive. So there are some situations where you can get a small group of those high-risk folks in that context, and they see themselves as wanting to go back to the group that was on the path of making something of itself.
Yeah, and I think this is a perfect example of taking a principle and making it custom to your groups. And again, you may find, and it may be those individuals, you may find that you've got those ultra high risk guys that you don't want in your group. And then there's also a belief that there's like the kind of the top 10% you could consider if you do a psychopathy scale, they come out sort of sociopaths. You probably don't want them in your group. You may find people that have certain characteristics that are not, you may not want your high-risk pre-contemplative guys in your group. So no, right, but whereas your high-risk guys who are in maintenance and they are now in a position to influence. So again, I think we have to take the principles, put them together, and then make it work in your context. Again, because all I can tell you is in general, right? And then you guys are giving me great examples of why in your environment this is working well. But you've thought through some of these issues too. So, right, I'm in a group that starts at 2:30 and gets out at 4 of people who aren't very committed may be very different than a group of individuals who are there specifically because they want to change the nature of their Friday night. Hey, we're not going to go hang over here. We're going to be in this community center doing something positive. So again, I really appreciate that you guys are bringing in the realities that you're experiencing and I think we're thinking through how the principles have to be flexible, but I think they still hold true kind of at the core.
Well, in the home setting with the 300 hours, I wouldn't allow, I couldn't allow that to happen as far as the habitual criminals who would want to influence the others. Excuse me.
Okay, no, and again, I think each of your contexts is a little bit different, so as you're listening to it, you're taking it in and making it work. Did you want to add something?
I think, given that the general tone is really, taking this evidence-based approach for the groups that believe that having that mentor participate is a positive, if you were tracking that, we could go from these anecdotal statements of we know versus the data shows us that we have groups that have these individuals versus groups that don't have these individuals, then I think we could have a much more rich conversation about what do we actually know versus what we think we know. And I think that'll help us get back to some of the crux of the principles that you were mentioning earlier.
Thank you. And did you want to add something?
Well, I just want to bring up, because I think we keep drifting back to the substance abuser, and they're wanting recovery, and they maybe have hit their bottom or whatever. But the criminal, in my experience, doesn't think that way. So I don't want to get, I'm here to learn how do I help the criminal change the criminal thinking, the core beliefs that you mentioned about your core belief in your family wanting, the best for your family. Well, a lot of my experience with criminals, that's not what their hope is in the morning. Their hope is who can they get over on, how their entitlement to this, society is treating them back. And I think that's on our side. How do we start addressing those issues without being out of our scope of practice, and at the same time in collaboration being able to meet the needs of the community?
Okay, so let's move through this and get to the cognitive behavioral part. So again, the need principle we talked about. The first thing is you need to assess the criminogenic needs, and then within the context of what you do, you may be doing different types of assessment. You may be doing an educational assessment. You may be doing a psychosocial history. So again, that basic criminogenic needs assessment probably is going to be done by someone in the criminal justice system, but depending on the nature of the intervention that you're doing, there may be specialized assessments that are helpful in addition. But remember, and we talked about this, you don't want to set all of these needs in front of an offender and say, okay, go to it. It's really important to prioritize them with the help of the offender, and it may not only be on the numbers. Someone may not be high need in a particular area, but they feel like that is a high priority for them. Hey, I need to do this so I can get my kids back. Last thing you're going to do is say to them, well, that's not one of your highest needs. Well, it is for her right that second. So we want to know the numbers. We want to understand the context, but then that part about engaging with the offender and making sure that they have self-determination. They may choose a need that is not, now you may have to kind of negotiate a little bit so that of the top 3, you may have 2 that are on the numbers and 1 that's on the person's feeling, or you may be able to come to agreement that all 3 of them are on the numbers and they're important to the person. So again, that's an an engagement with the offender in a conversation to prioritize the needs. And you don't move on from those top 3 until they're met. So we don't give timelines and deadlines for meeting needs. You have to have this need taken care of in 3 weeks, and then I'm going to give you another one. That's a little bit taking kind of old school probation, taking this idea and then melding them in a way that's probably not that useful because it creates a lot of stress and anxiety and doesn't give you that real-time change. Now, I say focus primarily on criminogenic needs. Again, usually this is a conversation I'm having with people in the criminal justice system. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to consider the criminogenic needs and how they fit in with the other needs that you may be focused on. And if that's housing, you're going to say, well, housing's not a criminogenic need. Okay, but I can put someone who's totally still criminal thinking in housing, and they're going to blow right out, right? Because the neighbors don't want them there, you don't want them there. So what else do we need to focus on to create an environment where that referral or that placement is going to stick? And that may be very well the criminal thinking. That let me help you get up tomorrow and not think about who you're going to get over on. Because putting you in a apartment building is not helpful to anybody at that point. We want to be customized to the individual, and I think that's a lot of what we've just been talking about. This is not cookie cutter. This is not a recipe. This is not everybody's going to go through the chute in the same way. We are dealing with complex individuals who have complex needs. But that doesn't mean that we can't stick to the principles. I believe that we can do both. And behavioral intervention has the most impact, dealing with the thinking, and that is true no matter what your main focus is. You can provide, so cognitive behavioral intervention is not a thing in and of itself. It means adhering to principles of cognitive behavioral intervention, but you can have cognitive behavioral substance abuse, you can have cognitive behavioral employment, you can have cognitive behavioral violence intervention, right? So you can take the cognitive behavioral part and the content part and find curricula that that work for that. Okay, so we did the criminogenic need factors, and again, you have the list on your slide. Responsivity factors. Again, this is a reminder, primarily to criminal justice practitioners, that we're dealing with people. So when we talk about the appropriate works, we need to think about three things. We need to think about the risk level of the person, we need to think about their needs profile, and then we need to think about who they are as a person. So that may be, and I think this kind of goes back to the more cultural, environmental issues as well. We need to be familiar with, and again, you guys can give me a great example, I'm sure, but you don't want to send someone who grew up in this neighborhood over to that neighborhood to get treatment in a because that's where the residential treatment is. Yeah, but your guy's going to walk in the front door, take a look around. Nobody looks like me, whether it's because I'm white and they're all black, or I'm black and they're all white, or they all speak Spanish and I, don't. Whatever that is, when I walk in and I look around and I don't feel like, or they're all old. I hear this one a lot. That's where you send the old guys. I'm not going to that place. They're all old, right? They walk in, they look around, and they feel very uncomfortable, and they walk right back out. So that's a responsivity factor. Culture, ethnicity, language, age, gender. And I think we're pretty good at gender in terms of responsivity factor. I think that the providers, obviously if you're providing female only, you're going to get female referrals. If you're male only. However, if you sort of say we provide to both, but 95% of the people in your program are men, women aren't going to feel comfortable there. So you can say you're sort of co-ed, but then what have you done to create an environment where women feel as comfortable even if they're in the minority? Or the same way for a cultural group. Hey, we deal with every race. Okay, great. But does every race feel comfortable there? Have you created an environment where people of different races feel comfortable? Or if people don't speak the majority language, have you created an environment where they can just say, hey, I don't speak English to this level. Is there someone that can sit next to me and translate? Or so have you thought about those responsivity factors? Because if we don't think about them, it kind of seems funny to say that the responsivity factors always have to factor into the referral, but you know what happens? What the biggest factors in the referrals are where there's a bed, what time of day it is, and what day of the week it is. Right, so referrals deteriorate as the week goes on, and you have slots and you have people, and we fit people to slots regardless of responsivity factors. This will not move us forward to offender change. So again, this is kind of just the human part. This to the treatment providers, you're like, really, you have to tell POs this? Yes, we do. We have to tell POs this. And again, how people think. How people, and this is a great example. Journaling is very popular. Journaling is a very popular intervention techniques. And so, well, what happens if you just gave a journal to someone who is functionally illiterate? Right? And we do it all the time. Well, now he's disobeying that he got told to complete this journal and bring back the homework, and this happens, I think, in custody a lot too, and in the community. And then he doesn't bring the book back, but he's not going to say, well, I didn't do the worksheet because... And some people are really embarrassed about how their handwriting looks. I did a class in the jail, and I ended up sitting with a young man, and he and I, being mindful of this stuff, I was trying to ask him questions that were not going to kind of put him on the spot and see if I could do anything to help. And he finally said, my handwriting is, I'm really embarrassed. And he never felt like he had practiced enough handwriting and you know, probably again, like you were saying, didn't spend a lot of time in school and certainly didn't have, you know, his cursive little dotted lines so that his F's went down and his G's went over. And he just was really uncomfortable turning in anything in writing. But if I talked to him, he was thinking about the assignment, and his reading was fine. It was just, for whatever reason, his physical writing was not where he felt comfortable, so he wouldn't turn anything in. Well, if I wasn't as mindful of this, he's getting check marks, then he gets booted out of the program, and then he's not programmable, and then then we go down that list. So these issues are really important to be mindful of. What kind of, and again, certainly we should be making assumptions that that everybody is illiterate. There's a lot of people who are very comfortable reading and writing. But not everybody, and in what language. So just things to be mindful of.
I just want to commit, because I hardly see learning style in there. I think it's very important to understand how your client learns.
And thank you. Yes. And again, we like to hand out a lot of papers. Here's your folder. Here's your court orders. Here's your rules. Here's your Put them in the folder. Hand them to you. Now go home and review them. Well, again, some people like to hear things. And on the other hand, sometimes we'll give someone a whole lot of information verbally without backing it up with anything in writing, and they're not a verbal retainer. So it's like, and when you're stressed out, it's very difficult to retain verbal information when you're stressed. Remember, offenders are stressed when they're in a PO's office, when they're coming in for an intake and treatment. They're stressed. It's a stressful environment. And now all of a sudden we're giving them information as if we're having a conversation, and they get home. Well, what time are you supposed to go back? I don't know. Well, and I went to the intake over here, but I'm supposed to go to the treatment over there. But they show back up where the intake was because that's where they had been. Well, didn't you hear the group is over there? And then you're like, well, he's not motivated. He doesn't want to change. Why should I put my energy into him? Well, maybe he didn't get the information in a way that was easy for him to retain or to check back later or even have someone else do it. Right? And we kind of have this, well, they're adults. Well, okay. But still, sometimes the girlfriend, mother, wife, grown child is someone who's going to review the paperwork and help that person be mindful of when the appointment is and what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, and again, nobody wants to be told anything by someone who they feel doesn't know them or doesn't understand them. They don't know anything about me and they're telling me I need this. So sometimes, again, that's back to the listen more, talk less. When people feel like, and when they have something to say, when someone has something to say, you need to listen to it. Right, so comments like, you're here to listen, not to talk. We need to get through this. I need to do this orientation today. That's not helpful because that person then leaves and feels like they've just been told to do something by someone that doesn't really care about them. So my officers always say, well, what am I supposed to do? Give them a hug? No, don't give them a hug. You don't have to give them a hug. But they do need to feel like they've been heard. Okay. Core correctional practices, this is not part of the training today, but on your little quick start guide, you actually have the core correctional practices on the back, so you just have a little info. So my desire to have a bunch of these little small group conversations is rapidly running into reality.
Go ahead, but I wanted to throw something out, but go ahead.
Well, so I just wanted to think about the best use of the time that we have left. So let me finish this principle. Okay, so we had dosage, and we've talked about it, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time again, but people need to have a certain amount of time, and now that's where the dosage literature is going, that 100, 200, 300 hours based on risk. The treatment principle, and this is one, again, that we've alluded to, we talked around, but I just want to make sure that we've said it. The most effective interventions are behavioral. Yes, Freudian psychotherapy might be really useful, but it has shown to have no impact on recidivism. So it's staying in the here and now. What are the problems that are happening? That kind of flies in the face a little bit of the trauma-informed care, which is much more of a what's happened in the past and repairing past harm, at least as I understand it. So cognitive behavioral for people who are trauma impacted, that might be like kind of where we need more research and more literature, because primarily speaking, cognitive behavioral therapy kind of doesn't care why you are the way you are or how you came to be the way you are. It's sort of like, where are you and what do we need to do now? So I would say that it could be missing pockets of individuals who are so impacted by former trauma or former experiences that they're not really in the here and now. And so to deal with someone in the here and now who's not there with you, you're going to miss, right? And again, I'm not a clinician, so I don't want to go too far down that road just because I'm going to get myself in trouble. But I suspect that there is a place to say, hey, this person was so impacted by something that happened in their childhood that you have to go back and deal with that. And that may be, there are methodologies for
DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy is one of them.
Okay, so again, that's probably a conversation for people that are at that higher level of treatment, but
it's evidence-based.
yes, and so this is kind of your general, this is sort of the general thinking on the cognitive behavior. Action-oriented, so in other words, role-playing, not people doing what you're doing and sitting and listening only, but the more people are engaged in the conversation, and that was why I wanted this to be more behaviorally based, but we're kind of so social learning practice. So when someone says what, you can talk about hypothetically what you would do. Okay, so the guy gets on the bus, he was the guy that I got arrested with and he got off, and I'm the one that did the time, and now I'm off and I see this guy, and so the minute he comes through the door, I'm up and I'm at him because I'm angry, right? And I've got all these feelings. Okay, well, what could you do differently? Instead of having him tell you, well, I could, you role play it. So I'm the guy that gets on the bus that you're pissed off at. You get up. What are you going to say to me? What are you going to do differently? So that's part of that social learning, practicing the skills, hearing yourself say it, using certain worksheets to go back. Hey, what are the common patterns of every time I've gotten in trouble? Oh, it's because I was here with my girlfriend, and every time she decides to do this, I go off on whoever she's talking to, and this is the root of my problem. Oh, I never realized before that the common thread through all of this is every time I'm out with this particular person or my brother or whoever it is. Oh, okay, now I can start talking about it. So again, the core correctional practices have a lot of research behind them, but that's a kind of a, so anyway, you can kind of look at those on your quick start guide. Okay, so just a quick research slide. Because at this point we have hit the core elements of evidence-based practices, which are risk, need, responsivity. We have to use actuarial risk to understand needs. We have to do more qualitative assessments. We have to do the actuarial assessment to understand risk. We have to do a more qualitative assessment to understand needs. We need to treat the highest risk individuals with the most intervention. We need to address the individual needs of people, prioritizing the top 3. We need to understand who the person is in terms of all of the elements that we just discussed. And if you do that, so where it says adherence to all 3 principles, that's risk, need, responsivity. When we do all of those things, we can expect to reduce recidivism by 27%. So you may have been hoping that if you adhered to all the principles, we could reduce it by 100%. No, sorry. But just think about for a second how many fewer crimes, how many fewer victims we could have in our community if we could reduce recidivism by almost 30%.
Because of the multiplying factor of that, maybe 27% up there for the individuals, but then that multiplies out to families, schools, communities.
Yes, nice. Thank you. So it is pretty impactful. It's pretty amazing to think that by adhering to those 3 principles, we could make that much of a difference. Even if you adhere to 2 of them. So you've been able to get all that booking information, understand the risk, and just start to supervise by risk and treat by risk and keep people separate. And not overload people by need. So we've done risk and need, but we haven't quite gotten to responsivity. We can still expect that, like 17% reduction in recidivism. When we drop down to 1, it drops down a lot. It drops down a lot. So getting those 2 is really is where we can start to see a difference in terms of all of those things you said: crime, victim, community, families. And look when we don't use any of them, that bar below the line actually suggesting we increase recidivism. So when we ignore risk, when we ignore need, when we ignore responsivity practices, we can actually be doing more harm than good. And I think that's where this idea, kind of back to our beginning, where we talked about, does it always have to be evidence-based? The highest level? Do we have to be adhering to everything? No. But the more we do, the more it means. And if we can keep building on the principles, we can make a huge difference. I'm inclined to keep talking, but I will give you guys just because I wanted to kind of hit them all, but, yes, you have a suggestion?
I just have a quick question. So this slide that you're showing, it says it's from Ameda Studies in 1999. Is there anything more recent?
So let me, you know what, and I think this goes, yes, thank you. This also goes back to, I think, one of the requests that someone had. So let me tell you about a couple resources that are, and I think this one goes more to the assessing the evidence and local practices. So thank you for that question. If you take a look at, there's a couple websites out there. The one that I was looking at most recently, so I'll tell you about that one, is Washington State Institute for Public Policy. And it is the foundation for what they're calling the Results First project, which 2 of our counties in California are doing, Fresno and Kern. Are working as part of the Results First. But I believe firmly that we can all get a lot of good information by going to the website and utilizing the public information that is there, where what they have done is they have set a bar for meta-analysis, and meta-analysis is basically just meaning what we talked about at the beginning with Robert Martinson, where he gathered everything that had been done in a particular area and he used standard research techniques to put them together to say, well, what do we know from all of these instead of just individual ones? So what Results First does is, first of all, they set the bar and they say, if your research is this good, you're in. If it's below that bar, you're out. So it gives us a little bit of an assessing the evidence, that the request that someone made, that we talk a little bit about that. And then they do a meta-analysis and they give an effect size for different types of interventions. And more importantly, or as importantly, they do a cost-benefit analysis. So within those studies and those jurisdictions where they were done, they get a handle on how much it costs per offender to give this service. And then they do a very complicated assessment of what does it save. So basically, if you think about the math, a cognitive behavioral intervention reduces recidivism by 27%. And that means in this county, so many fewer people committed crimes. We just save money on the district attorney, the public defender, the court, the jail, probation, parole. They take all those costs and they say, and cognitive behavioral intervention for a year only costs $7,500 to give to an offender. Now we take this, let me come right back to you. We take this $7,500 cost, here's the benefit, and they give you a ratio. And at the same time, they give you the impact of that recidivism reduction, and they give you how likely it is if you implement this, will you see this success? In other words, how complicated is it? If it's pretty easy to do this program, you're gonna get like in the 90s. So you're gonna get you have a 95% chance if you implement cognitive behavioral intervention in your county, you'll save this much money. It is a beautiful tool that is updated. In fact, I promised I wouldn't do any plugs for my company, but this past Friday, they actually released the impact of day reporting centers. Not based on anything that we did, but on national literature showing that there's actually a benefit to day reporting centers. So, and it's got everything in there from substance abuse treatment in custody, in the community, housing. So take a look at the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, WSIPP.
.wa.gov.
Thank you. .wa.gov. It is a very easy to use tool to allow you to assess the evidence. And what you can do in terms of comparing to local practices is you can say, which of these are we closest to? So it's not going to obviously say, the East Palo Alto Family Center does this, because it's just not able to get at that level of granularity. But you can say within your program, you have a cognitive behavioral group, you have a domestic violence group, you have a parenting class, for example. You can then look at each of those elements and see what is the impact of providing that type of service to offenders, and how likely are you to be able to do it well and to see that kind of impact. So I think to answer your question, it is yes, this is being updated, and I think you pointed out the SAMHSA also has a website that has practice models and how impactful they are. And then on the juvenile side, because I promised I would try to bring in some juvenile information, there is Blueprints. And the Blueprints website, again, is a similar type of resource that shows you national models and how impactful they can be and in terms of reducing recidivism. So you can customize and localize this much more granularly than I am able to do in a conversation. But yes, the resources are out there. I think you will find them very straightforward and helpful. So thank you for asking that question, and I think hopefully it goes to your question also in terms of assessing evidence and being able to use it in a local way. Those websites, I think, are a mechanism to do that.
What is the Blueprints for Juveniles website?
Someone with a smartphone is going to tell you in a minute. Yeah, and please feel free to use your smartphones while we're talking. This is a 2015 kind of class. So if you're finding additional information as I'm talking, please add it to the conversation.
So before we adjourn for lunch, I wanted to throw out something getting back to, can I say this, criminogenic needs?
Yeah.
Did I say it right?
Yeah.
And treatment principles. Something I think would be very helpful, because you mentioned someone you were working with who couldn't write. And, they were embarrassed by their writing. And that just, as teachers, part of our education is we're given a general overview of children, with special needs and disabilities. And that, in looking at treatment principles, these are all things that you do with, you do with kids through adults who have disabilities. The modeling, cognitive behavioral therapy. So I think some transparency and education about learning disabilities would be very helpful in dealing with clients. So that when you get into, okay, in the popular terminology, oh, they're antisocial this or antisocial that or antisocial behaviors. Well, I'm not most teachers aren't clinicians, but we would have more information to bring to these descriptions, such as emotionally disturbed, which starts getting diagnosed at like 2 to 3 years old. Autism, on the autism spectrum, they're diagnosing at 6 months old. So yeah, ED, oppositional defiant, so that you can have a clearer picture, even if you're not a clinician, of who you're dealing with and what their needs are. And it doesn't have to be very expensive. So Stanford University this month is having a panel on children's disabilities, and it's free to the public. And it does, look at trajectories for adults. So it's easier to get informed, to have a handle on who is this person in front of me. Just because as a teacher, you absolutely need to know who you're dealing with to teach them and keep the classroom safe.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like a staffing meeting, multidisciplinary staffing type of thing that you could bring to them. And I think on the juvenile side too, the fetal alcohol syndrome is a big issue that's coming to light now too, in terms of behavior and some of the etiology of that behavior when it's FAS can be dealt with maybe differently than a youth coming into the system.
And your person who's having trouble writing, my son has a problem. It's called dysgraphia.
Okay, thank you.
And the writing will never change, but it doesn't mean that they're not thinking creative people.
Mm-hmm. And we can make a lot of assumptions sometimes based on things. Right. And it's easy, right? In our world, we bring people in, pigeonhole them, and then we know what to do, and then we move on, instead of kind of getting behind that. So we are at principle 4, 5. Someone can help me out. The skill train with directed practice, and again, this is the treatment principle. This is just again the cognitive behavioral intervention is the one that has been shown through research to have the greatest impact. I think, again, from the criminal justice side and from the treatment side, what really that meta-analysis, going back to Robert Martinson, was that unspecified counseling really has not shown to have an impact. So when someone says, well, I sent them to counseling, unless you're very specific about what's happening in that counseling, it can actually be considered an inappropriate intervention. So in terms of appropriate works, it can be the opposite. So this one is really the key to the actual intervention modality. And again, I'm sure a lot of you know a lot more about that. Ideally, the core correctional practices means that the probation officer or the parole agent is doing the same thing in their meetings with the offender that you're doing in treatment. In other words, you're focused on the needs, and the officer himself, or him or herself, is a role model and asking for role playing during the meetings. But again, that's more kind of a probation. So I know this was the one that you really wanted to talk about, increasing positive reinforcement, right? This is old school behaviorism. We know that people respond to positive reinforcement. You cannot change behavior by punishment. You can extinguish behavior, right? You can stop someone from doing something by punishing them. But if you want them to do something, you have to incrementally incentivize the positive behavior, okay? I'm pretty sure I got that right. I'm not making this up. This is old school, like Skinnerism, Skinneral behavioralism. And we have, for many, many years, ignored this part of behaviorism. And we have, again, we being criminal justice system, have really focused on the punishment side. We are trying to extinguish behavior. Yes, we are. We're trying to extinguish criminal behavior. But what's the one way to do that? Yes, you can try to get someone to stop doing bad stuff, but people are going to do stuff. So what do they need to do? They need to do good stuff, right? So how do we incentivize more positive behavior? And that is basically a series of appropriate incentives. I think, again, most treatment agencies, this is not news, this is not new information. I think treatment organizations tend to do this sort of inherently. But I think where we can do it with probation officers, because a lot of times, interestingly enough, the offenders want their officer to think well of them. They want their officer to know that they did well in treatment. They want them to know that they're coming. When the officer, and the officer's responsibility then is to take that information and not say, well, of course you went, you had to, otherwise I would have arrested you. That's not the point. The point is that they did go, and then how do we celebrate that success? Whether it's hey, your treatment provider called, told me you were doing well, I just want to say I'm proud of you. Or I'm pleased with your progress. It makes a huge difference. When the certificates come back from treatment into the probation file, it makes a big difference. And this is not to say that probation shouldn't be doing an incentive-based program on their own. I'm just kind of targeting it more to who's in the audience. But probation is, again, this is so ideally there would be a combination of sanctions, appropriate, swift, certain sanctions, and incentives. The reason the principle is named this way is because, generally speaking, we don't have to help probation officers sanction. Usually do that pretty well. Okay, so we're getting closer to the top of our pyramid. I think this goes to your point, and this is maybe one of our points here, which was engage support in the community. How do we pay attention to this moving from the institution? Now we have something called reentry, right? And we're focused on that period of time as you're leaving an institution and you're coming into the community. For most of the people that we're talking about, if not all of them, the AB 109 population, they're coming out under some sort of supervision. Okay, so then there's another point of reentry, if you think about it. There's the point of reentry where they're leaving supervision and kind of moving into the community. And what's really interesting is, in a lot of ways, we have set up a lot of great programs for those individuals, right? And now we're going to fund more programs while they're under supervision. And then what? Then we pull, and this has been happening in juvenile for a long time under the JJCPA, right? The Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act, that provided funding for juveniles on supervision. Then all of a sudden they're not on supervision anymore and they can't get services. So I think we want to be really careful that we don't create, and I think from my point of view, from a funder RFP point of view, I would want to know, what is your sixth principal plan? How are you going to engage support in the community while someone's under supervision and being funded, so that when the funding ends, the treatment doesn't, and I'm not talking about sustainability of that program, I'm talking about how are you connecting someone back into their faith-based community, back into their home AA group, not just going to AA, but with a sponsor. How have you encouraged and assisted that offender in being able to stand on his or her 2 feet 100% when that funding has been removed because they're no longer under supervision? For a good reason, right? They successfully completed supervision, and now have we set them up to fail because we haven't thought about re-entry in terms of that next step from being under our supervision to being in the community. And so, and I think, again, it sounds like in the areas where you guys are much more tied to the community, that may not be as big of an issue, but I think in some areas where the funding is held inside the organization and there isn't that thought, okay, now they're 90 days out from supervision ending, what have I done to connect them to the community that is in their naturally occurring community? And that can include, again, family members. There's been a lot of history of probation not wanting to talk to family. But sometimes that is, again, may not be, but sometimes there are people in the family. There may be someone who's an aunt or, someone who's involved in a positive relationship that sometimes it can go either way, and that's part of your assessment. And that's, again, it's not a slam dunk, it's a look at those people and see who they are. But again, those are just some ideas, but this is one that I think we've gotten kind of to the top of the pyramid, so therefore it may be not as foundational, but I think it's extremely important.
So some of this is reminding me of restorative justice principles. Has that worked its way into the evidence-based?
Not directly, but I think the connection that you're making here, which would be, right, if this person is kind of persona non grata because of what they've done or perceived to have done or led, how do you get that person then to be accepted back into the community? And I think absolutely, I think the restorative justice principles fit here. So is that a referral to meeting with your victim and trying to reconcile and now, is this person paying restitution? That goes a long way for people to feel like, the justice system served them as the victim. But I think where they're willing, and the victim has to be the one who agrees to participate in restorative justice, right? So some will, some won't. But still how many treatment providers are asking about restitution payments? That is a way to do some restorative justice, even if the victim isn't agreeing to do it. And I think that's all of our business. If someone's and again, can they pay back everything? Maybe not, but have they made a commitment to consistently make a payment toward their restitution?
The sector right now today with prices so high, I have a lot of guys even in or outside of the criminal system afraid because the services I provide, how much their fees are, and to move out on their own when they go, when they do.
Yep.
But at this point, it's like a year wasn't enough, or 2 years. I extend if need be. It just like on the timing thing. When they come home and meet all these goals and jump through all these hoops and get maybe a housing voucher that nobody wants. There are so many other controlling factors that they have to be prepared for. Education, concern, and confidence and safety are a lot of issues.
Yep. Yeah. Yes. So I think the key point was, you can think about connecting them to the community, but there are still a lot of barriers particularly in housing. So if you've got a supported voucher and nobody will take it, that doesn't help you. Or you've got the voucher and then it runs out and you're still not sort of prepared with employment.
Being criminals again,
Yeah.
correct?
Right.
Okay, well, that's what I'm saying.
Yep.
It's not just who's running it.
Right.
It's for everybody.
For across the board. Yep.
It's just not even for a criminal.
Absolutely.
Things have changed within the time that we're there. For every 3 to 5 days in prison, for every day in prison, it's like 5 to a week here. out in the freeway lane. You know what I'm saying? So for every day that they're spending behind the bars with food, with clothes, with PG&E, with bedding, with all of this already supplied for them, and then now, like you said, like the juvenile system, okay, you're done, you jump through the hoops, you're out. What now?
Yep.
I feel there should be a preparation.
And that's exactly what this principle is suggesting, is where are we thinking about the next stage when they're no longer supported by funding? And then the last two are measure relevant practices and provide measurement feedback. And those two principles, in a nutshell, are sort of, again, back to that local, what should a funder be expecting from a provider? What should the provider be expecting of themselves? And who should be getting this information? So is there a way to create that environment where frontline workers are putting information in that's not only useful for managing the case, but is useful on the back end for understanding who's been through the process? Can you then take a cohort of people who went through it in 1 year's time and then follow them through the system to see if they've reoffended? That, in a very simplistic way, that would be ideal to know what the impact has been. It requires collaboration. A community agency may not have access to those records. You may have to send your list of names over to, probation or CDCR to find out if they've been rebooked or incarcerated or to the DA to see if they've had a new conviction. So it requires collaboration to go beyond, and I think that feels like a big barrier for an agency to say, well, once they've left me, I have no way of knowing how well they've done. So I think that's another area, a very, very strong area for collaboration. But even knowing who's been through your program and what they got is tremendously powerful. Because they call it the black box of intervention, right? So here's your people coming in, here's your people coming out. Even if we can go and look and see what the recidivism rate is, if we don't know what they got while they were in treatment, we don't really know what worked. We don't really know what intervention was helpful to them. So beginning to think about tracking the individuals coming into your program, key characteristics, demographics, and then tracking the number of hours of dosage they're getting. And what is it that you're providing, again, through and this is not a plug for ETO, I just happened to see a demo of it and I thought it was pretty interesting, the efforts to outcomes. They have competitors as well, but they are kind of freestanding case management systems that allow even medium to small agencies to have a case management system, because I think it's a big barrier. I mean, cost is a big barrier, and then the time it takes to keep it up.
My backdoor babies.
I'm sorry?
My backdoor babies. They didn't catch it the first time. They just want to be around. They don't care. It feels safe. Backdoor babies.
And then who should have that information? So the measurement feedback. It's interesting if you think about even just on your bulletin board in your agency having quarterly stats, for example. How many people came through? What did they get? Were they successful? So that the clients coming in are seeing what your agency has done. In probation, we can do a similar thing. We can put up stats of, how many, what's the ratio to officer to offender. You'd be surprised how powerful that information can be to the people that are actually being impacted. Because, again, we're talking about them, but are we always talking to them or including them in the conversation? And hey, you may have an offender that comes up and says, hey, I was looking at your stats and I'm wondering about this. And you're like, oh, isn't that interesting? So I think that idea of feedback, and again, are providers providing that information back to the funder routinely, back to probation? Is probation providing information to the treatment providers about big picture stats? That's a start, and that's that measurement feedback part. Someone sitting somewhere with a computer collecting information is only as good as other people that see it. So on that note, yes, I won't apologize, but I would have liked to give you guys more time. I think that I hope that the kind of lecture portion of this was helpful, and then if we could take maybe 5 minutes and make some closing comments.
This isn't a closing comment, but a situation where an organization that deals with people with mothers with substance abuse issues, and one of the funders says, in their RFP, we want 95% success rate. And so, when you're dealing with a population of substance abusers, that's an awfully tall order. So we asked, well, do you do 95% success in filling out the form? And they said, which it would even be hard because a lot of people leave before the end of treatment. And they said, no, 95% success rate in outcome.
Well, what I always say is it's good, it's nice to have goals. That's what I would say. It's always a good idea to have goals. I would go two places. I would go with redefine success, and it's good to have goals. Well, if I could just take a second and just kind of see if we hit our I think we dealt with the time frame issue, which I'm very pleased about. Hopefully we dealt with the innovation part, really with the idea that if you keep the principles in mind when you're faced with having to make a decision about should we do this or that, should we try this, is go back and run them through those 8 principles. And I think if you can hit at least the big 3, then your answer may be yes, let's innovate. If you're innovating in a way and you're saying, well, that doesn't really hit any of the principles, then I would say maybe that's a cue to kind of go back and rethink it. The juvenile, we didn't hit a lot on it. I think the blueprints maybe was the nugget for juvenile. The cultural environment, how do you guys feel? Did we hit some of that? No? Okay. Well, thank you for being honest. Maybe you could offer me some suggestions on how to better address that? Or
so in your chart on the risk, needs, and responsivity, the research is dated back to 1999, and yet it's still the prison population and jail population has increased more than one-third since that time. And in Bonta, 10 years later, I think that Bonta, 1995, he said in 2004, in research that did, that racial bias definitely is a responsivity for most PO when it comes to recidivism, which is at that time pretty high. And so those are the parts that are the gaps that are missing from my perspective.
okay.
When we have African American males that now occupy 54% of the prison population in this country, that needs to be addressed when this subject is topic is talked about, because that is an alarming amount of people that are in that predicament.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm hoping we hit some of the local, at least we had a conversation about maybe how to take some of the principles and think about them in the context of your environment. So maybe we could say we did some of the environment and not as well on the cultural or ethnic component of it.
Can I say something about the environment? I mean, you were saying earlier that, for a person to not go back into somewhere where they know and then commit a crime or something like that. There are instances where probation or parole wasn't very forthcoming with information, pretty much off their desk, in a rush, only wanted to incorporate communication when they needed to make their report, okay? Which didn't help the 300 hours on a high risk, or misdiagnosing high risk and incarceration while individual incarcerated took medications. Okay, well then he's on straight parole. No, he's 1170H. We want to talk about AB 109, but that's been going on for years, with the reentry collaboration. There's all these other different things he could have been eligible for, but that wasn't the case because, okay, in my home you're taking psych meds and to come over to the home to see where he was, to reinforce the okay or it's good here, or to even come and see where he was would have helped out a lot, and this person didn't fail all the way, but there were certain key points that needed to be done. And since there wasn't, it was a mixed communication, but it all generated from placement.
Ye-
So it's like, not only does the person, who's coming out of jail or county or prison, have to take on the role of their own lives, but they take on the roles of the parole and the probation officer too. And what they're gonna think and then where they are, so they got it all figured out by the time they get somewhere where it's needed, and then they feel like that they've been lied to so much to where they wanna just go ahead and say, forget it, I'll just run. And I'm like, no, don't run. Just stay here, please. And then it's nobody else's fault, but it's your fault, it's this fault. So, the environment, in some cases, a change of environment or an authorized change in environment would be good instead of being mandated to an environment that may have their life at risk.
Okay, but I appreciate your,
They're
yeah,
not gonna
input.
come, they don't wanna come because
Yep.
they know at this point they'll die. And is that okay?
Yeah,
So,
okay. Yeah, it's your time.
We have in the past had other programs that dealt with reentry, and during the time that we were planning to write the proposal, and I'll use Achieve 180 as an example, that whole issue of inequity in terms of men, African American males, and other males of color and Caucasian males came up big time. And in the statistics for this county was very shocking. But this is a national problem, and I'm not trying to excuse San Mateo County at all, but it needs to be addressed and some action taken, but it never gets that far. So I want to say that part, and so it really is an issue, and it really does need to be addressed, and we continue to bring it up, and eventually, hopefully, we'll begin to take the action that we need to turn that around.
And I think the good news is you've got a lot of leadership in this room. You know, if this is a start of a conversation or a continue of a conversation that you guys have been having, that, you know, that's something that you got, at least you got the ear of people in the same room so you can continue this conversation. So I'm hoping I addressed the assess the evidence. I think those websites, and I appreciate your question to remind me to say them. I think if you spend some time on those websites, you will find them very helpful in terms of what to bring back. The Results First project is, I don't know if they're still looking for counties, but they will come into individual counties as technical assistants and help you figure out amongst the providers that you have here, which ones fit into their model. So it's kind of really interesting program. It's a Pew Charitable Trust funded program, and I can give you the lead's name if you want to contact her. Local practices, I think you guys have hopefully had a chance to discuss a little bit about what's happening locally in this venue. The trauma-informed care, I think we, hopefully something that maybe you can bring someone in that's an expert that, can address some of those issues if that's, sounds like it's an important issue, and I agree that it is. So with that, am I just wrapping up? Okay, I think your hosts have provided lunch, so I really appreciate your guys' attention and thank you.